today's video, we are going to do a shoot with a disco ball, and I'm going to show you how to create dramatic effects by restricting and controlling your light. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here, and I am all about creative lighting. I love playing with hard light and shadows and reflections. And I also like adding a little bit of vintage glam to my work. And so my model today, I think, looks like a supermodel, so we are going to go for a supermodel 90s vibe. But we have one key element that we're going to build the entire concept on, which is this disco ball. I picked it up online, and I actually have several disco balls that I played around with, and I've started to love this effect because it instantly makes things feel fantasy, glamorous, like an album cover, like a supermodel. However, if you've ever shot with a disco ball before, you'll realize that it's not that easy to get the creative effect, to get the reflections off the disco ball, because you need to consider your quality of light as well as the control of light. So that is what I'm going to cover today. Now, by the way, I've mentioned how much I love creative lighting and these sort of effects. Well, if you check out the links in the description below, you can find my Creative Lighting 2 guide. In this guide, I have a wide range of different setups, including some that use a disco ball and gels and creative filters and much more. So if you love this, I've got more in store for you. But let's start off with this setup to talk about quality of light. Now, very often, if you're used to doing portraiture, you probably lean towards softer light sources. Maybe you use big softboxes or umbrellas with diffusion, and that looks great on your subject, but it doesn't necessarily give you what you want when you're playing around with reflections. And I want to show you what I mean. So we're going to begin with just one light, and I have my disco ball sitting out in the middle of the scene on a Savage Universal Fashion Gray background. Now, the reason that I've chosen this background is because if I choose black, for example, it'll be really hard to see reflections on it. So I need something that's a little bit lighter. Now, the concept for this shoot is I'm going to go with all neutral tones, a silver dress, the gray background, the silver disco ball, and I'll probably even try some in a high contrast black and white. And so that's why I picked the color palette here. So I'm going to begin with a very typical portrait modifier. To my right-hand side here, I have a ProPhoto D2, and on it is a 3-foot octabox. This is a beautiful quality of light for portraits, but you're going to see that it doesn't really give us what we're looking for when it comes to a disco ball. So let me take that first shot. All right, so here you can see exactly what I am saying. I'm using this soft light source, and I see none of the sparkle and the glam that I want from this disco ball. And that's because this is a soft quality of light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go towards the hardest quality of light next by taking off this modifier altogether and just going with a bare strobe, no modification at all. That is definitely going to move me in the right direction, but there's a few more things to consider. Okay, so now we're starting to see our first reflections, but I don't see very many of them. Like, I see them in the foreground, but that's about it. And this is for two reasons. So we got our reflection because we finally used hard light, but the problem is that this bare bulb, this light is illuminating everything. It's lifting up the shadows, and so the highlights from the reflections are against filled in shadows, so there's not much contrast. In other words, we're not really controlling the light, it's just going everywhere. So one thing that's going to really help you out is doing something to restrict the direction of light, to control it so that it is not spilling everywhere, which would be now adding a modifier. But in this case, it means a hard modifier. And you have a few choices. But in this instance, what I want to start with is a grid. Now, I have other videos that go through grids. You can find that in the link in the description below. What they do is they control the spill of light. They restrict the spread of light. And they come in different sizes, different degrees. So you can make very tight beams of light, or you can allow it to spread out more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a grid, add it to my strobe, and use that to hit the disco ball in the front. And then there's more to come. Now you'll see a couple things have happened. First of all, the background has gotten darker. In fact, much of the scene's gotten darker, and that's because we've controlled the spread of light. And you're also seeing a lot more of that reflective pattern because we still have hard light, but we're not allowing it to bounce around everywhere. And this is closer to the direction I wanted, but what I really wanted is I wanted to see the reflections all across that background. And this is the next piece of the equation, is that you have to consider the direction of light. So right now, The light that is illuminating the disco ball is coming from the front, and so those reflections are coming back towards camera. What I really need is to bounce the light off of the back of the disco ball in order to kick that back onto the background, which is why we're going to add our second strobe. The second strobe is to the back right-hand side of the frame. It has a bare bulb on it currently, but what I'm going to do is add another grid. I already know from our first light that controlling the spread of light is going to be really important. So I'm going to go ahead and add a 5-degree grid. For my strobes, the 5-degree is the tightest grid. Now you may have something that looks a little bit different. Maybe you have a zoom reflector with a grid that fits in the front. Just go for the smallest number. And if you don't have access to a grid, try something called cinefoil. Cinefoil is like black tinfoil, and you can use that to create a makeshift snoot, for example, to wrap that around the head to create just a little area of light. That is going to give you a similar effect. So let's go ahead and add our second strobe. Right, so this is a lot closer to what I was going for, and you can see all of the reflections on the background. If I didn't add the grid, if I just had the bare bulb, you wouldn't be able to see those reflections hardly at all because that spared strobe would have just spread out everywhere. So this is definitely closer. One of the things I recommend you do is when you are trying this effect, aim to shoot in a very dark space. Turn off all of your ambient light. Close the windows. Do whatever you can, because then you can actually use the modeling light of your strobes to see when you're achieving that reflection effect. You'll be able to see it in real time. And so that backlight that I have there, when I added the grid, I was adjusting the angle just slightly so that I could see what point was giving me the most reflecting effect. And so this is really what you need for this setup. You can build onto this. I'm using just 2 strobes, but you could use 3 or 4, reflect from different angles. And so, for example, maybe I want more reflections off of the front or the side of the light here. I could keep adding restricted lights, for example, like grids. So this is your starting point. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in my model and I'm going to modify this for an image that is a little bit more refined with a lot of impact. And I'm going to show you one other variation besides a grid that you could add for hard controlled light. So let's bring in our model. All right, so we have our model out here. Let me show you what the light is looking like so far. That's perfect pose, perfect. All right, so the light looks okay. Like I don't hate it. I also think maybe in a black and white, it might look a little bit better. But I think this is where I can start doing refining. Like I have the disco ball effect, but what I would really like is to restrict the light a little bit more. Maybe just have a pocket of light on her face. Let's see what that looks like. Now, I already have a grid, and it's probably one of my smaller grids. So if you don't have a tighter light source, I told you you could add cinefoil, or you could bring the light closer to the subject. The closer that you bring it, the more concentrated it will be. So I want to show you one more tool to illuminate her face, and it's going to be a specialty modifier called the Westcott Optical Spot. This is one of the things I use for this specialty setup. In fact, sometimes I will use multiple. So the Westcott Optical Spot is a modifier that allows you to create tiny slices of light on the face. It actually has a lens in the front of it. So if I want to create a slice just down the middle of the face, even just her eyes, how about even one eye? I can do it with this modifier. So I'm going to add that, create that slice of light, and then see how we're doing. This one off. You can see how this type of modifier gives me a ton of control, and now there's no light on the background, but just beautiful hard quality of light as a pocket of light on her face. But now we have another downside. That disco ball, it's dark in the front. Before, when the light was spread out more, I had some reflections in the foreground, but I've lost that now. So this is where I could add another strobe. Like you can achieve the effect with 2, but if you want to add more and more reflections, you can keep adding more strobes. So I'm going to add my third and final strobe, again with a 5-degree grid. I'm going to add it to the front left of the frame, pointed at the front of the disco ball, just to give me a little bit more of those beautiful textured reflections. So I think this is what I need for the lighting in this setup. I have the tight, controlled slice of light on the subject's face. I have a controlled light from the back, a hard light source reflecting off that disco ball, and then another one in the foreground for that foreground texture. So you'll notice that all of these are very hard lights with a lot of control. That is the secret to photographing a disco ball. Now, by the way, you can add a lot more to this effect. For example, you can add a star filter if you want to see reflections off of the sequins or reflections off of the disco ball. Or you can introduce gels to any of the lights that are here, or even a fill light with a gel, which is one of the things that you'll find in my creative lighting guide. But I think that I love it as is. And so the next piece, and the most important piece of this equation from now on, is going to be her expression and the pose. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit more creative. Use a disco ball in a way that I haven't before, because I've shot this several other times, and so it's always nice to try to stretch your creativity and push what you've achieved in the past. And by the way, for these shots, I'm going to be using the Canon R5 and the Canon RF 24-105 because it's going to allow me to get tight shots of her face, wider shots to see more of the reflections, and it gives me a lot of flexibility to shoot. All right, so let's get the shot. All right, so we totally captured images that fit my vision of a 90s supermodel pop vibe, and they are beautiful, dramatic, and have lots of controlled slices of light, which is exactly what I was envisioning. So if you want to see more of these sorts of lighting setups, be sure to check the links in the description below for my creative lighting guide. And if you want to see more setups like these, I have so many more videos that go in depth on creative in-camera techniques, everything from lighting to filters and much more. So you'll want to be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.